what a lovely chance to have a look around this prison. It was really important for me because it's in these walls and under this roof that my story really begins. Inside the dark walls of Crumlin Road Jail, pretty much exactly 100 years ago, you would have found some very radical, very prominent suffragette women. The Ulster suffragettes were active from around 1913 was when there was the first militant action, although the movement had been growing in other ways before that. The first action here was to smash the windows in the Belfast Post Office. I'd love to think what they would do with the Royal Mail headquarters today, which is a building almost entirely made of glass, that had a field day. There were pillar boxes that were destroyed, telephone boxes that were destroyed, the same sort of tactics that suffragette women employed all around Great Britain and Ireland. The Pankhursts came to Ulster and set up a branch of the Women's Social and Political Union. And inevitably, Crumlin Road Jail started to see its share of political female prisoners. I want to tell you about 3 women in particular. Dorothy Evans, Mary Larmer, and Madge Muir. Having come here from Britain to set up the WSPU office, they were arrested following a fire at Abbeyland's house, which at the time was a drilling ground for the UVF. The suffragettes had declared war on Ulster Unionists. That's a whole other story for another seminar. That fire cost £20,000 worth of damage, which, when adjusted for inflation, equates to just shy of 2 million in today's money. So clearly it was an act of quite extreme criminal defiance. The women were brought to Crumlin Road Courthouse, just across the road. And you have to remember, the WSPU had adopted a policy of complete non-cooperation with male authority, with male society. The way they saw it, they had been disenfranchised, they had been denied their citizenship, and therefore they did not obey male law or cooperate with the male legal system. And they made this point in court by kicking and screaming and shouting. The reporters of the day told of a chaos and a deafening din. Madge Muir apparently threw a book at the magistrate, followed by a handbag, followed by a walking stick, which apparently the last one had a reporter, and that partly accounted for the very bad reviews that they got in the press. The result of this court hearing was they were remanded in custody with no chance of bail. And so it was into this place then that the next step of their battle began. Their resolve was tested in the dark misery of this Victorian hellhole. It was the practice of the WSPU at the time to go on hunger strike as soon as they were imprisoned, and our 3 prisoners did just that, and they also denied water. The WSPU motto of deeds, not words, took on a desperate, painful reality for the women who sacrificed their physical health in pursuit of justice. The authorities had practiced force-feeding of suffragettes in Great Britain, but this treatment was so barbaric that it had caused horror across society, even among people who weren't particularly engaged with the suffragette cause. So the last thing they wanted was a murder, and what they did was they instituted an act called the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, which became known as the Cat and Mouse Act, and it basically meant that the suffragettes were released just at the point where their health got so poor that they were in danger of death. And they were released with the expectation that they would stay out of trouble and present themselves for rearrest when they were feeling better, neither of which obviously happened. And when our 3 prisoners were released on conditional release, Madge Muir was actually rearrested the very next day, and was so weak still at that point that she was carried into the courthouse on Crumlin Road on a stretcher. So there was really no regard at all for the political cause of these women, and certainly not for their humanity in the way they were treated. There were many more women who walked that torturous path under this roof. However, the First World War came along and saw an end to the militant action of the suffragette movement for the most part. By that stage, all of the leaders of the WSPU were in prison. Many were suffering severe ill health. Some were dead. The battle for the vote was later won in increments over the next decade, But the sacrifices of those women have never been forgotten. When I think of what they endured here, for example, their ability to maintain that radical conviction that the world and the powers that be were just simply wrong and should not be obeyed. And when I think of the toll that it took on them personally, I sometimes wonder if my part-time endeavours in feminist blogging even register on the same scale. I look at my life with its relative comfort and my freedom to influence my social surroundings, and I wonder if these women would even recognise today the same spirit that compelled them. For me, it's really important to ask these questions because we live in what many want to believe are post-feminist times. There are many who believe that it was enough that the vote was won, and they see everything that has happened since then as just some sort of process of progressive realisation of all the rights that come with being enfranchised. So they would maybe be keen to dismiss the modern feminist movement as something that is affected, that it's built on some kind of constructed false notion of victimhood, and really we just all need to get over ourselves and stop being big crybabies. But I live and breathe feminism every day, so for me the question is, am I delusional? Or is there something about all of those little uncomfortable gendered experiences that eventually came together for me? Is there something in that of the suffragette spirit still alive? I would like to point towards 3 clues. The 3-point sermon is alive and well. 3 clues for me that spirit is still necessary and is still alive. The first one is this. The world that they fought for does not yet exist. It would be very naive of us to think that they gave everything of themselves purely for the right to place an X on a piece of paper. The suffragette struggle was not about the vote. It was about finding an answer to the problem of the subjugation and the oppression of women. The only thing that would have driven them to such extreme lengths was a vision of a world where women would be elevated socially, physically, and morally to an equal footing with men. And as a result, they would be freed from the drudgery and in many cases slavery of a life lived without any true agency. So they threw all their hopes into suffrage, the vote, the citizenship that it would offer, and they believed that that would change women's destiny. I'd like to say they could look at our world 100 years on and see the fruits of their labour, and in many ways they could. They campaigned, for example, on equal pay. People don't always associate that with the suffrage movement. That was an issue that took many, many more decades before legislation even existed to try and protect it. And that legislation in itself hasn't even proved to be particularly effective at ensuring the equal treatment of women within the workforce, with a continuing 15% pay gap in the UK, a constricting space now for women in the workforce as welfare reforms kick in and women find themselves increasingly burdened with caring responsibilities. There was also a group of suffrage activists who were qualified in the field of law but were prohibited from practicing. And what they did was they started a Courts Watch group. I'd like to think if they were doing it now it would be a blog. Probably would. They reported on the performance of the Irish courts. It was an Irish group in particular that did this. They reported on how the courts performed on dealing with men who had committed crimes of a sexual nature, including domestic violence, and who were regularly let off without any accountability. So I wonder what that group would make of our 7% conviction rate on rape in the UK, or the fact that 1 in 5 women in Ireland have experienced domestic violence. They'd probably be happy to see women present across almost all sectors of professional and public life, but they'd probably also be disappointed that equal representation seems like a far-off dream, or that women in those positions can still catalogue multiple experiences of sexist slurs, harassment, or discrimination. I'm sure they'd also be happy to see that women nowadays can exercise our sexual freedom in a way that would have probably caused considerable pearl clutching in those days. But would they feel particularly content with the way that female sexual availability has become the norm in popular culture? That the female body is more readily commodified and exploited than possibly at any time in history? And when you add to all of these things the horrors of sex trafficking in the most vulnerable women and girls, the continuing use of rape in conflict zones as a weapon, the fight for emancipation and bodily autonomy in cultures where extreme oppressive religious practices have kept women completely enslaved, the fact that poverty predominantly still has a female face, the list could go on. It isn't hard to see that the conditions for a feminist social movement still exist and will continue to exist until every injustice in the name of gender has been eradicated. To point two, then, the opposition sounds very familiar. Now, when I first read that it was the Daily Mail who actually coined the term suffragettes in an attempt to belittle women, it didn't surprise me. Not much has changed there. But when you look closer at the anti-suffrage movement, or anti-suffrage arguments of the day, it actually becomes quite terrifying, because they are the same arguments that you will encounter regularly in our contemporary society. For example, opposition to the suffrage movement came from a religious standpoint, with arguments based on ideas of natural law and some sort of divine purpose that man and woman were created for. And I don't think I have to try too hard in our own context to illustrate how much this still has an impact on women's rights today. Whether it's reproductive rights or simply the right to be listened to as a person equal in capacity and importance to a man, religion still poses considerable barriers for women. But it's not just religion. Science also proved to be very useful to the anti-suffrage movement. A popular argument at the time was that women's childbearing capabilities would be affected if they got involved in politics, as they possessed a limited amount of energy in their bodies, and if they thought about the complicated world of politics, they might stop menstruating. It's laughable when we hear it now, but it does resonate strongly with many women's current experiences that any pursuit outside of motherhood is somehow unnatural, or at the very least inferior to the role that our physiology has clearly designed us for. To sum all of this up, for me, the most telling example of the fact that women have to basically put up with the same shit, different century would be summed up in a quote that was from a letter published in the Times in 1912 by a very famous doctor of the day. He said, he was speaking on the issue of women who demand intellectual equality, and he said, look, the glory of women lies in her power of attraction, her capacity for motherhood, and an unswerving allegiance to the ethics which are special to her sex. That would be things like gentleness and caring and peacemaking, all those things that apparently all women are. Those three dimensions are so prevalent today in how women are constrained within traditional rules. And for me, I think my own journey into feminism was probably best described as a kind of rebellion against the idea that these three dimensions are all that define me. And that brings me to my final argument. There's still a need for rebel women. I've borrowed this phrase from Hannah Sheehy-Skeffington, who was an Irish suffragette. She wrote about the lack of public support they actually had at the time, and she suggested it was to do with the fact that they were not only rebelling against the powers that be, but rebelling against their own sex. They were rejecting the strict definitions and choosing to believe that they had every right to be regarded in the fullness of their human potential. And for the suffragettes, it brought ridicule. Attempts to shame them back into the boundaries of womanhood. Not much has changed there today either, and that rebel spirit is still required. It's a rape survivor who says, no, that wasn't my fault. It's a mother who refuses to pass on body shame and body hatred to her daughter. It's Malala refusing to accept that the rules say she doesn't deserve to learn. It's Noxolo Nogwaza, the lesbian activist murdered in South Africa because she was refused to be ashamed of her sexuality. So for me, I like to think of the Belfast Feminist Network as a place of refuge and inspiration for the rebel women of Belfast. And we need rebel men too. If gender equality is going to be a success, it won't be enough just for women to move away from the false dichotomy. We need men who are allies, who reject violence, who understand their own privilege, who refuse to make objects out of human beings, who are carers and co-creators. So I hope I have successfully demonstrated that the suffragette spirit is not only needed, but is alive and well. I'd like to think in another 100 years, it may not need to be, but until that day, the stories of courage that these walls can tell will spur us on. Thank you.